social order, but also reinforces it on many counts. In these usages and contrasts, justice acquires an overlap of determinations, both substantial and comparative. But unlike ideas of equality, democracy, nationalism, etc., Ambedkar did not reflectively focus on the idea of justice as such. There is only one instance when he attempts to do so. Drawing from the philosopher Henri Bergson, he suggested that the principle of justice is a compendious one and includes most of the other principles which have become the foundation of a moral order. Justice has always evoked ideas of equality, of proportion, of compensation. At the same time, justice is not merely a social norm that holds a society together. It is also something that one owes to oneself as an individual or community. It is the right relation within us with regard to affections and reason, dispositions and pursuits, as well as in the community. In this sense, it regulates how an individual governs himself or members of a community behave towards one another. In this sense also, self-regulation of justice elicits responsibility, stipulates the right measure, and calls for the right disposition. It is something to be striven for as much as being a constitutive norm of sociality. While it promotes the happiness of others simultaneously with the happiness of oneself, it also brooks no oppression. When you make the scope of a concept far too expansive, as in this instance, does it not become far too vacuous? However, on closer textual scrutiny and across its myriad usages in Ambedkar's writings, certain essential attributes of the idea of justice as a norm governing social relations or as social justice stand out. It denotes what is due to a person. While the measure, what is due, sounds like the criterion that Plato employed to denote justice in the Republic, in Ambedkar it acquires very different connotations. Since human persons are not merely unique, but also of equal worth, what is due to a person qua person are considerations that hold equally good to everyone. As self-defining beings, what is due to a person has to factor in liberty, and its denial is an affront to human self-worth. At the same time, such personhood cannot be nurtured except in and through the community one belongs to. Justice as a measure meting out what is due to a person can be realized only in communities. The quality of the community, in turn, can be assessed and held accountable with regard to the extent to which they uphold this measure. In turn, only by being a member of a community, a person can be expected to be treated with justice. Ambedkar quotes from Dewey and Tufts to argue, from their book Ethics, to argue that justice is a privilege which falls to a man as belonging to some group, not otherwise. The member of the clan or the household or the village community has a claim, but the stranger has nothing standing. He may be treated kindly as a guest, but he cannot demand justice at the hands of any group but his own, unquote. What is due to a person then boils down to regarding him as of equal value, enabling him to define himself and the world around him in association with the community that he belongs to. A just community makes room for such definition by regarding each one of its members as of equal value. As a regulative social norm, Ambedkar is emphatic throughout that the core of the idea of justice lies in equality and respect for human personality. He even regards fraternity and liberty as derivative notions of equality. Therefore, where equality is denied, everything else may be taken to be denied. The idea of the human foregrounds these usages of the term justice. While redistribution of resources is integral to the idea of justice, Ambedkar feels that it does not wholly exhaust the conceptual space of justice. Justice is not merely liberties and rights, but also rightful share of a citizen in commanding his due share in regulating public life. He feels that both liberal and socialist dispensations prove woefully inadequate to measure up to the criterion of justice as they prefix citizen agency and confine its role in regulating public life. Similarly, institutional and policy designs may not accord with justice. For example, in a federal polity driven by contentions between communities, carving out provinces on communal majoritarianism may hold minorities hostage rather than be considered as equal citizens. As a norm governing social relations in a community, justice provides the foundation for flourishing such virtues as love. Ambedkar considers justice as prior to love. Writing to the Anti-Untouchability League regarding measures to be taken for the abolition of untouchability, Ambedkar says, justice alone, in my opinion, can open the possibility of love. Human bonds, compassion, and empathy are tested as genuine if those to whom they are directed to are first recognized equally as human. Conversely, there cannot be genuine love or social kinship among human beings unless it is anchored in justice. Justice is also prior claim to other claims, such as self-determination. If Indians seek independence from Britain on grounds of justice, they cannot deny the same to others, such as the untouchables. How to ensure that justice would prevail in public life? Ambedkar thinks that reason and conscience awakened to justice are important, but do not suffice. It is necessary to rally countervailing power to challenge an unjust dispensation. If conscience and reason can be insinuated into the resulting struggle, they can only qualify, never abolish the injustice. If injustice is to be abolished, it must be resisted. And when injustice proceeds from collective power, whether in the form of imperialism or class domination, it must be challenged by power. Ambedkar terms the movement launched in Mahad in December 1927 as a step towards social revolution, aimed to put an end not merely to the disabilities that untouchables suffer from, but a revolution that will remove all man-made barriers of caste by providing equal opportunities to all to rise to the highest position and making no distinction between man and man so far as civic rights are concerned. The Buddha is the great teacher of justice. His teachings not merely formulate the principles for a just society, but also propose supportive values that can radically reorder the world from the depth of injustice it is sunk in. Ambedkar terms Buddha's religion as perfect justice. Following his enlightenment, Brahma Sampati goes around proclaiming, and I quote, "The Buddha will bring comfort to the weary and sorrow-laden. He will give peace to those stricken by war. He will give courage to those who are broken in heart. He will give to those who are suppressed and oppressed faith and hope." Why should humans be extended equal value, which is the core of Ambedkar's argument for justice? As a norm, Ambedkar's considerations on justice are clearly premised on the idea of equal value of human beings. He points out that this value is not merely a juridical notion as equality before law, or a political notion as equality of treatment. It is a value that predisposes us to others in a certain way, and in turn demands to ourselves the same consideration from others. It sets standard for everyday life as well as to public policy. But Ambedkar problematizes the proposition that human beings are equally valuable. He points out that empirically men and women are quite unequal. Our experience highlights numerous facets of human inequality rather than equality. A man's power is dependent upon physical heredity, social inheritance, or endowment in the form of parental care, education, and accumulation of scientific knowledge, and finally, on his own efforts. Ambedkar feels that in all these three respects, men are undoubtedly unequal. The empirical fact of human inequality stares us at our face. Therefore, Ambedkar argues that if we stipulate equal value to human beings, it does not flow from our ordinary empirical experience, but is a construct or a fiction, which is nonetheless a principle that should govern our life. Only when we uphold men and women as of equal value, we will not run counter to some of our deeply held beliefs. Those beliefs become tenable only when we presume equal value of human beings. Four of his arguments are crucial in this regard. Interestingly, none of the arguments are based on imputation of a soul or man as partaker of divine attributes. The first argument is if heredity and upbringing, which make men unequal, constitutes the measure of their worth, then their freedoms in making their lives what they are will be on discount. It would mean ignoring human agency and endeavor and the kind of choices a person makes. Further, we will not be able to assign moral responsibility for human action and commend or disapprove human endeavor. Human freedom will find due acknowledgement only if we value people equally in spite of differences in heredity and inheritance. Human creativity and enterprise often radically redraw the configuration of initial conditions. If heredity and social privilege are the basis of treating people, it will not be selection of the able, it would be selection of the privileged. Ambedkar placed a second argument for equality in the Buddha's mouth. In the struggle for existence, if inequality is recognized as the rule of the game the weakest will always go to the war. Is it right? Some people may be positively disposed to it. They reason it will help the fittest to survive. It does not, however, tell us who is the fittest and are the fittest the best from view of the society. Those who are the best in view of the society at present, therefore, need not be the fittest and the most meritorious. The idea of who is fit and not fit is deeply caught in the reigning ideologies of the times. However, extending equal consideration to people may help the best to survive, even though the best may not be the fittest. Only equal consideration can save us from getting trapped in fleeting social considerations. Ambedkar also drew heavily from historical experience and scholarly reflections to shore up this argument. Instances are not uncommon when ordinary men and women demonstrate extraordinary initiative, courage, and creativity when the conditions called for it. There are numerous instances when a person was persecuted and his talents went unrecognized because he did not measure to the benchmark of merit that the guardians of the age upheld. Subsequent ages, however, were inspired by him. By only considering men and women as equal, such unfairness can be overcome. A third argument that he proposed was considerations of utility. A social body can bring out the best in men and women only when initial equality is extended to them. Utility and progress demand that we treat people on an equal basis. Ambedkar's fourth argument appealed to pragmatism. Statesmen have to handle vast numbers. It is well nigh impossible to go on the basis of need or capacity, particularly as they are susceptible to continuous changes. It is well nigh impossible to prefigure need or capacity. Therefore, with fairness in view, the rough and ready rule is to treat all men alike, not because they are alike, but because classification and assortment is impossible. Thereby, we avoid instances and traps of unfair treatment. Unequal treatment, on the contrary, begets dominance and ill-founded claims of superiority. They are an affront to human reason and freedom and do not accord with human dignity and respect. Inequality and dominance invariably have to take recourse to force and violence and webs of ideological distortions and insinuations to sustain themselves. Therefore, birth and natural assets, education that is not merited out of one's efforts, family name, business connections, and inherited wealth cannot be the basis for distribution of social goods. If our other deeply held values and even utilitarian and pragmatic considerations favor human equality, what kind of equality should we aim for? One could argue for different types of equality. Equality of welfare, equality of outcomes, equality of need, equality of resources, etc. Ambedkar upholds initial equality. If there is no initial equality, then social resources are going to be apportioned unequally for no fault of the disadvantaged. Extending equality of treatment to them subsequently will reproduce the unequal condition rather than make amends for it. Many forms of inequalities arising from dehumanization and disadvantage or unequal representation in domains and levels of social life may persist even when there is equality of treatment. Initial inequality, therefore, is not a reference in time, but to social condition. Some preferential considerations may have to be continued to offset unfair social condition or to ensure initial equality. Preferential treatment primarily makes amends to initial inequality and enables equality of treatment. These conditions call for a prior claim on these resources before others can make equal claim on them, because in their absence, those who suffer from initial inequality will not be able to make equal claims as the rest, leave alone nurture their worth. Preferential treatment reinforces equality and does not undermine it. Ambedkar makes a distinction between regarding people as equal and treating people alike. Given the fact that different people have different capacities, including those which are the product of their efforts, treating them alike may be unfair to those who, through their exertion, provide or potentially capable of providing a greater share of the social produce. Further, human effort has to be incentivized. If it is not done, then there is no enthusiasm to strive. If supportive setting for such strivings is not provided, then people who pursue it will not be able to do what they reasonably set out to do. On the basis of initial equality, differential accomplishments are possible, and equality of treatment is pegged onto such differential accomplishment. But every accomplishment cannot be rewarded or rewarded in equal measure, and social recognition of the same needs to be factored in. Similarly, while a society needs to positively reach out to disabilities and marginality, it also can set limits to the same on grounds of common good. Democracy is an essential requirement to resolve competing demands on available resources. Further, a society organized on a democratic basis directs its resources to ends that seem to it worthwhile to pursue, and as per this requirement, selects the kinds of people suitable to those ends. The best in view of the society, therefore, need not be the fittest and the most meritorious, but a just society employs its resources fairly to ensure that everyone realizes the perfection that he or she strives after to the extent possible. Therefore, equality of treatment after initial equality is always accompanied with the rider. It respects self-agency and the differential choices that people make. It makes amends for unequal considerations that accompany people through their life without no fault of theirs. And a society organized on democratic foundation decides the services it has to offer to sustain common good and the entitlements for such services. For Ambedkar, equality is a value to be cherished everywhere and across cultures. It provides a moral yardstick to judge modes of thought, cultures, and societies. However, he employed it to devastating effect to question the prevailing social norms and structures in India, as well as to assess its past. He felt that egalitarian movements, such as those of the working class, cannot make much headway in India, given the fact that social life there is embedded in considerations of graded inequality. In this context, the role of the state becomes crucial in sustaining a legal order of equality and freedom that can help sustain moral wellsprings to nurture an egalitarian ethos. While Ambedkar's focus remained on India, he deployed his conception of equality to critique liberal democracy and capitalism, racism and slavery of all kinds, colonialism and the comprador elements, and prevailing gender relations. He felt that while initial equality and freedom of choice can help, deleterious social marks can mar the prospects of the socially marginalized for long, even across generations. He argued that a liberal order throws the responsibility for survival in the struggle for social existence, one of the most difficult challenges to face on the individual. The capacity of the individual to meet this challenge depends on fair start, equal opportunity, and square deal. But a liberal dispensation is little geared to meet disadvantages such as untouchability. The challenge that he faces is worse than that of a slave in a slave society, where the master has an obligation to find work for him. Ambedkar counterposes Brahminism or Brahminism, terms that he uses as equivalents, to his idea of justice. Across his writings, there is an intense focus on this term, and he returns to it over and over again. As a concept, while most of its determinations persist over time, it gets repacked with new ones, and a few are reconsidered afresh. Increasingly, it was to become the frame that informed his approach to the understanding of Indian social and political reality, as well as transformative action. If the struggle for justice was the telos of his life, Brahminism becomes its bete noire, his adversary. He also reflected on its relation to ideas and ideologies that he regarded as inimical to human equality, freedom, and democracy. He saw Brahminism as a mode of organizing social relations on the basis of graded inequality, characterized by condescension from above and deferences from below. It is considered as a divinely ordained mode of organizing social relations and inevitably superior over the rest. At the same time, it was projected as reflecting endowments and deficiencies. It upholds caste patriarchy, as you all know, subordination of Shudras and untouchables, and subservience of women. It has a direct bearing on the mode of social division of labor, distribution of resources and opportunities, life prospects and entitlements, and sociality. It is very the ideology of class domination as far as Indian social formation was concerned. At the same time, it nips in the bud all prospects of rebellion against the system. Brahminism is not concerned with belief in God, afterlife, salvation, or even sacred scriptures. Its sole focus remains on the reproduction of social relations on the basis of graded inequality. It thrives on rituals and ceremonials. As a social contrivance, it is adept in foisting webs of lies and distortions, and constructs a make-believe world, occluding access to social reality. It employs the Karman doctrine as a religious justification to ensure that everyone remains bound to his social station, sapping the spirit of revolt. What consequences did Brahminism have on the idea of the human? The principle of graded inequality that it upheld was not merely a form of inequality. Inequality carried within itself the seeds of its own destruction. It invariably begets discontent and makes those who are aggrieved to combine against the common foe. However, under graded inequality, such an impetus does not arise, and even if it does, there is little room to express it. Given the unequal benefits and burdens assigned to each gradation, every level has a vested interest not to let the immediate rung below it from rallying against inequity. Those way below in this graded order are deprived of even the minimum resources by which they can imagine a relatively better condition of life and strive after it. Any such striving, if there is any, could be remorselessly suppressed, not merely through the resources that the higher levels command, but by invoking religious sanctions. Ambedkar constructs a genealogy of Brahmanism. He distinguishes between the Vedic religion and Brahmanism, the latter of having subsumed the former, that is, Brahmanism having subsumed Vedic religion. Brahmanism transformed Varna into caste, which in turn was made endogamous and hereditary. The idea of dharma was appropriated by Brahmanism and reduced into a set of rituals and rules. It entrusted the ultimate guardianship of political authority to Brahmins and justified removal of political authority that did not submit to their superintendents. It invested Brahmins with immunities and privileges and rigidified caste boundaries. Shudras and women came to bear its scourge. Brahmanism reduced the Shudras into the serfs to the three higher classes and women the serfs to their husbands, subjecting them to eternal servility and eternal degradation. They came to bear the brunt of the subjection and surveillance that its rules, prohibitions, and injunctions heaped on them. Manu, who codified and expounded the law of Brahmanism, made graded inequality inform the entire range of state policy and drilled into the bone and marrow of people. In the process, the pre-Buddhist division of powers that Vedic literature upheld between the Brahmin and Kshatriya was effectively shed. Ambedkar thinks that if the British rule has achieved anything in India, it is to strengthen and reinvigorate Brahmanism. He finds that other religions in India, such as Islam and Christianity, are deeply insinuated by it. Ambedkar pits Brahmanism against Buddhism. He argues that the Buddha opposed Brahmanism root and branch. He feels that the strife between Buddhism and Brahmanism is a crucial fact in history that has not been accorded adequate significance by students of history. He advances a distinct trajectory of the transition from the Vedic religion to Brahmanism and the triumph of the latter over Buddhism. According to this trajectory, Buddhism spread across India and found ready reception, especially among the masses and the trading classes. It threatened the very edifice of Brahmanism that was afoot. In order to don the mantle of superiority over the teachings of the Buddha, Brahmanism gave up or recrafted several practices of the Vedic religion. The ethic of the Gita extended to the masses a direct access to the divine by appropriating the Buddha's ethical teachings without questioning caste gradations. However, the kind of freedom that the masses, particularly Shudras and women, enjoyed under the Buddhist dispensation came to be strictly controlled through caste boundaries that acted as vigilantes over endogamy and commensality. Ambedkar saw Manusmriti as the classic text of Brahmanism. He drew attention to the praise lavished on it by the likes of Friedrich Nietzsche. He points out that Nietzsche in Antichrist commends Manusmriti for the case it makes for such avowals as will to power, violence, denial of spiritual values, Superman and the sacrifice, servility and debasement of the common man. He quotes Nietzsche to say, and I quote, "The law book of Manu, an incomparably intellectual and superior work, and it would be a sin against the spirit even to mention in the same breath with the Bible," unquote. A word in conclusion. While at times Ambedkar employs the notion of justice in a wider sense of morality or right frame, measure, or proportion, his focus remained on the principle that should govern sociality and public life. In this latter sense as social justice, he saw it as the principle that upholds human equality. He also argued that human equality cannot be upheld unless at the same time we hold fast to human freedoms to define what is good and bad, right and wrong. Such a self can fully take shape only in and through the community in which it is located. It is through their freedoms that men define their worth and their differential pursuits. Since freedoms are implicated in human equality, extending equal consideration may beget unequal and differential results. We need to make room for the kind of choices that humans make and their commitment and responsibility to those choices. Ambedkar, therefore, defended initial equality, which extends a level playing field to all. However, given the fact that certain social and natural disadvantages can affect a person throughout his life, initial equality is the base that should not be denied to a person through his life. Given the fact that certain talents and certain tastes may call for a large share of the social produce, depriving others of their life chances and begetting contentions, Ambedkar squarely entrusted decision in this regard to the democratic community. May I wind up thanking Asiatic Society Mumbai for inviting me, and particularly Meenal Shirsagar. It was so nice working with her in arranging this particular program. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Rodriguez. I think there is just so much in that presentation that to wrap one's mind around it within a short period of time is not going to be easy. However, I think I would like to sort of just foreground certain aspects of Professor Rodriguez's presentation today and say a few words about each of them. I think one of the most fascinating things to emerge from his reading is the idea that justice is co-constitutive of sociality, and that it comprises two what might appear two contrary impulses. One is what one owes oneself and what is possibly achievable only within the context of a community. And I think these are very rich notions, because on the one hand, what one owes oneself might appear an individuated sense of justice, whereas what one might expect from within the context of community might require oneself to submit to a shared sense of values and worth. And I think for Ambedkar, both these concerns came together largely because he understood Hindu sociality as he found it in his context, and perhaps in ours, to be in a state of denial about justice to those that were not considered equal. So while he draws on anthropological writing on the notion of the stranger who is denied justice within the community, or rather than being denied justice, who cannot expect justice within a community that he or she is not a part of, he or she might be favored, may be loved, but may not expect justice. And I think for Ambedkar, both things were important, that one must be loved and one must be treated justly. And I think this bringing together of what Professor Rodriguez calls genuine love in the pursuit of justice is a task that I think has been foregrounded in our understanding of justice, largely by the conditions of the Hindu caste order. And from within, theorizing from within the Hindu caste order, Ambedkar raises questions of universal importance in terms of how might one owe oneself justice while at the same time relating to community in a genuine spirit of equality. So what then mediates the relationship of the individual striving to accomplish those perfections that are there in potential within oneself with the charge that is laid on the individual by the community? If the charge is one of negation and rejection, the individual can expect no justice. If the charge is one of alienation, the individual might expect a measure of love but no justice. But if the charge is one of mutuality, where there is recognition, what Professor Rodriguez calls initial equality is accepted as a value, then it is possible for a situation to be created in which each of us, along with the potential that we hold in ourselves for perfection, may actually be able to realize that perfection. So, and what mediates the relationship of this claim for justice with the measure that one owes oneself is, of course, in an empirical, historical sense, the law and the state. These have mediated our claims for justice, especially in the modern period, in the era of what Ambedkar considered the individual. But Ambedkar is not content with looking to affirmations of equality that proceed from within a juridical sphere. For him, they are necessary but never sufficient. And I think, therefore, the whole politics of recognition become central to our coming into a common understanding of equality and justice. That we grant equal measure to each other, that we see equality as co-constitutive of our relationship to each other. I think that then becomes the basis of the possibility of justice and the possibility of perfection. And that granting of equality to each other, even if it is something that the state and law mediate in the absence of social recognition, in a social context where equality is not granted in an everyday sense, ultimately, as he demonstrates in his Buddha and his Dhamma, it is that sense that we grant each other out of a respect for each other. And it is that Sadhamma, which he discusses at length in the Buddha and his Dhamma, which then mediates equality. And what is this Sadhamma, of course, is something that he interrogates and explains at great length in the Buddha and his Dhamma. So no wonder that Professor Rodriguez points to the place of Buddha in Ambedkar's ethical and political universe as the symbol of perfect justice. And as a symbol of perfect justice, the Buddha is concerned with all those things that Professor Rodriguez has unpacked for us. One is the idea of initial equality, of equal consideration, of an equality that will bring about a common social good, the utilitarian argument, and also in a pragmatic sense that one must hold equality as a value, even if it is a fiction. And I think the Buddha constructs the fictionality of equality in and through his parables, never through a complete definition of equality, but by locating equality within a series of parables, which of course Ambedkar draws on in his writings in the Buddha and his Dhamma. Then, of course, Professor Rodriguez's unpacking of Ambedkar's understanding of Buddhism and Brahmanism. And why Brahmanism? And as he put it, and I think it's something worth repeating and rethinking, that it is not concerned with the idea of God or soul or the afterlife or salvation, but it is concerned with the reproduction of the social, with social relationships and with all those rituals, ceremonies, and belief systems, which sometimes express themselves through a web of lies, through falsehoods, just so that the social order is reproduced within the hierarchical framework of graded inequality. And I think this drawing out of the meaning of Brahmanism from Ambedkar's writings is a very important thing for us to keep in mind as we seek to assess the exercise of power and authority in a secular context as well. Because Brahmanism is simply not only about the sacred, it is equally about the social reproduction of life, which then brings up the question of how is the sacred and the secular bridged by Brahmanism in some very important ways. And I think this is something that one can also think about. And Professor Rodriguez points to what Ambedkar held important, which is the importance of the sanction that intervenes to retain the social order in place and which draws on willy-nilly in a spirit of complete falsehood on the sacred, which is why Ambedkar goes on to speak of how the Hindu social order is unique because it is not a social contract, but which is actually defined for us as a sacral contract, because the foundation of inequality is the Godhead himself. So this sort of sleight of hand by which social reproduction is granted sacrality in the post-Vedic period is something that Ambedkar returns to. And as Professor Rodriguez has pointed out, each time he returns to the argument, he weighs it with a different meaning. And so it becomes important to read his work both genealogically as well as thematically. And I think these are very important reflections that emerge from Professor Rodriguez's presentation of Ambedkar's investment in the ideal and the fiction and the importance of equality, equally in the importance of community. And what is this community? And this community is neither to be determined by birth or lineage or status or gender. Instead, it is a community that is to create and recreate itself through democracy. And democracy here is, of course, both what is kept alive through promises of law and constitution, but it is also something that has to be renewed in practice, time after time, day after day, which is why Ambedkar is very skeptical of the adjacency of democracy to liberalism. He unhooks democracy from liberalism, but neither does it hook it on to socialism either, because I think he had a very stout and suspicious attitude towards a state that he accepts as historical necessity. While the state and the law are parts of our evolution into modern subjectivity, the state and the law are not to be taken as primarily something that we will have to always rely upon. Which is why he's concerned in Buddha or Karl Marx with the socialist notion of the state shall wither away. So under what conditions will the state wither away? He does not grant it a telos. Rather, he grants the whole process, the possibility of the state withering away, as something that is likely to happen if we are ethically vigilant. If we are able to find a kind of measure by which both equality and liberty are granted a certain sort of balance and brought into a certain kind of balance as well. And this is his critique of the socialist state, that you might have a kind of numerical or distributive equality, but the price you pay for it is liberty. And as he often recalls in several contexts, including from his very early review essay of Bertrand Russell's book, in the pursuit of certain ends, certain values are sometimes sacrificed. The whole argument between means and ends. The question is to judge what has been rendered ineffective or rendered sacrificial in the achievement of certain ends. So one has to therefore assess the whole relationship between means and ends, not simply in terms of pragmatism or utilitarian considerations, but in ways that will help us conserve as much of the original end as possible in terms of their moral worth. This is also something Ambedkar is very concerned with, which is why, while he thinks of equality and justice in terms of love, of social kinship, of a reconstructed community through democracy, he is also concerned about the nature of resistance to power. And of course, while resistance is anchored in power to some extent, he is not very sanguine about what will power do once power acquires authority. And he brings in the Buddha as well into this argument to gloss the idea of a just war. Can any war be just? Will the end of the war help us retain those ideals of justice that he considers as constitutive of the social itself? Or will a just war erode the basis of this social that we wish to bring into existence through a just war? And I think he does not really rest on a full solution, so to speak. He points to the Buddha. And I think one of the things that he marks as important is that how might you bring about justice in the event of a just war, when that justice has to train itself against those who have been exploitative and oppressive. And here his arguments derive from two sources. One, history, of course, because in Ambedkar's understanding of global history, the emergence of Nazism cannot be diverged from the Treaty of Versailles at the end of the First World War. And he thinks that justice without a just peace will not secure the just society. So therefore, I think he again brings us back into how might one leaven considerations of justice with considerations of ethics. And while Gandhi, for example, would speak of leavening justice with compassion, Ambedkar squarely situates the problem of bringing about justice at the end of a just war within the realm of the spirit with which justice is delivered. Justice has to be delivered not with a spirit of bitterness or anger, of self-righteousness, but in a spirit of peacemaking. And of course, some of this has been brought into modern debates around truth and reconciliation, but Ambedkar is not concerned with reconciliation here. He is concerned about how a newly emergent political order of the state and society will actually work towards justice at the end of a just war. And I think here is something that is fascinating because in a situation where you can easily resort to arguments that see only the recreation of power, even in the making of a new society, Ambedkar does not engage himself in what at times it seems to me is the post-colonial obsession with the productive nature of power, which is something that Michel Foucault talks about, that opposition to power cannot but be an expression of power. Ambedkar grants the value of resistance to power. He is aware that that will involve a certain measure of power, but he wants us to constantly think about what will actually hold this power in check, even in the good society that we seek to bring about, whether a law and the constitution and the state are enough, whether a battle against what he views in the Indian context as Brahmanism and what might be viewed in the world context as anti-democracy or as Nazism or fascism, how might one sort of constantly be vigilant about the return of these tendencies, as well as the possibility that the just state can become unjust. And he does not fall back on meditative reflections on the productive possibilities of power. Rather, he forces us to reckon with our capacity for ethical renewal. And I think our capacity for ethical renewal is what brings him to the Buddha. And that this renewal cannot ever stop, that it is a project that one has to constantly work and rework. And I think it is here that, that much of what Professor Rodriguez has spoken to us about acquire a certain kind of both challenge as well as instills in us a sense of hope. And I think the historical critique of Brahmanism and the challenge that Buddhism posed to Brahmanism, on which there's an entire tradition of scholarship, both in Ambedkar's own time, both in the classic post-Vedic Brahmanical writings, as well as in modern attempts to understand that relationship. There's an entire field of writing on this subject. And Ambedkar was familiar with with aspects of that writing that were available to him in his own time. But I think going beyond what the historical scholarship has to say, between the fraught relationship between Buddhism and Brahmanism, in some ways, the antagonistic relationship between them, or a relationship that is hard to pin down to either antagonism or non-antagonism, but which is really constitutive of civilizations itself in the subcontinent. And I think by pointing us to the Buddha in the context of how might one render justice constitutive of the social, how might equality be the cornerstone of this justice, how might we cultivate ourselves as equal beings. Ambedkar points us to the Buddha and his Dhamma, and invites us to constantly revisit the time of the Buddha. And every such revisiting has to be done in ways that the present demands. So the present and the past, the relationship between the present and the past is simply never one of atavism, of actually being praiseful of the past, of claiming that everything that was in the past was perfect, even if it is a Buddhist past, but to constantly negotiate that relationship so that the Buddhist tradition, such as we seek to understand it, is simply never a Buddhist tradition frozen in texts or monuments or in sayings, but is renewed again and again for us in the here and now. And I think this is what Ambedkar meant when he speaks of how might the stranger be made part of the community. Because what might bring the stranger within the community and make her a subject of equality and justice is the principle of Maitri, which is not just fraternity, but which is a sense of relatedness. And I think this relatedness is what he seeks to uphold against graded inequality, which is a relationship in a destruction of the self and a destruction of the other. You don't owe yourself self-respect, neither do you respect others. The complete absence of mutuality in the caste order is to be countenanced by Maitri. So, and I think it is in that spirit I understand Professor Rodriguez's presentation today. Thank you so much, Valerian, for this very rich and very thought-provoking presentation.
I think there are questions in the chat box. Geeta, you could perhaps select them. And
Yes. There is one question.
you're on mute, Dr. Rodriguez. You should unmute yourself.
Unmute myself.
Yeah. So there's one question.
Yeah. Geeta, I can't hear you. Okay.
Yeah. Can one read some similitude in Dr. Ambedkar and Pandita Ramabai's conversion and its place in the larger politics of emancipation they both upheld? Ramabai converted in 83, 7 decades prior to Baba Saheb. However, this moment did not receive the kind of attention that Ambedkar's conversion received. Could one read some continuity between these two thinkers? Valerian, do you want to take that now? While others put their...
But Geeta, you can join me in terms of complementing whatever I want to say. See, with regard to Pandita Ramabai's conversion to Christianity, I think there were very, very different considerations that were at work relative to the considerations that went into the making of Ambedkar embracing Buddhism. I wholly agree with those ideas which Geeta you have highlighted. I personally think that for Baba Saheb Ambedkar, his whole life's trajectory, he thought, eventually led him towards Buddha's enlightenment. So conversion for Baba Saheb Ambedkar was not crossing a threshold but actually realizing himself the way that he has lived throughout his life. So I think it is a very different kind of ways that Baba Sahib Ambedkar embraced Buddhism compared to what Pandita Ramabai did. Although I can't fathom what are the motives that led to Pandita Ramabai choosing Christianity. But Ambedkar definitely had Ambedkar's motives are before us today, partly due to his writings, but also his reflections on what constituted Buddhism for him. Thank you.
If I may add very briefly to what Valerian had to say about Pandita Ramabai, I think if one goes with Valerian's argument that his conversion to Buddhism represents the fruition of the choices he had made throughout, and as Buddhism providing both a historical, epistemological, and ethical framework for those choices. One comes to Ramabai's choice of Christianity, and there is a lot of writing by herself and others as to why she did that, not in a straightforward sense, but in several ways in which she sees her embracing of the voice of the religion of Christ and her embracing of the Bible as text, as a space where, as she says memorably in one instance, neither man nor God tells you what to do, but you can actually realize the spirit within yourself through the example set by the Sermon on the Mount. So I think it was very important for her to have a sense of of faith and a sense of self-realization that was not mediated by priest or by let's say the institutional structures of a religion. And she had a very contentious relationship with the denominations that she worked with, the Christian denominations she worked with. That's at one level. At another level, I think, in keeping with the history of individual conversion in the 19th century and much later, it was also an existential choice, a way of remaking oneself in terms of what one would eventually like to be, moving away from what one is seeking to reject. And that's a very fraught enterprise in the absence of a larger historical and civilizational narrative. And also because at the time that she converted, she is seen as being disloyal for having chosen a religion that is linked to colonialism. So I think those are very important differences between her choice and Ambedkar's, but there are also interesting similarities. The similarities have to do with their rejection of Brahmanical Hinduism. And while for Ramabai, it was more difficult to overcome the social framework of that religion, in that even when she works with a range of outcasts from society, from the Brahmin widow to those that are saved from the famine and so on, she was not in a position to construct a democratic community of the kind that Baba Sahib envisages. A, there were practical and historical restraints, and B, that fulsome language of democracy was not available to her at the moment that she set up these institutions. And her own situation as a woman who had stepped out of the sexual and social contract, right? By converting out of the Hindu social order, by remaining a Brahmin widow who did not marry, but who remained a single mother, and by bringing in women who were single into the ashram, whatever else they did later. I think the nature of that experience was also very different from what Baba Sahib had to deal with. And this is where the whole question of caste and gender become very interesting. And it's an interesting debate to link the two to each other. So I will stop there. There is another question here. Let me just read that out. 1 second. This is, what would Ambedkar say to contemporary upper caste feminist intellectuals on the Dalit women's question? She, as a figure and recipient of intergenerational injustices, hate and disrespect, love, education, respect for Brahmin women, that's given.
It's a very complex question. Complex in the sense Let me put it like this. There are places where Baba Sahib Ambedkar considers women as a whole and women as victims, not merely of the economy, but of the social structures as a whole. We have today a great deal of writings to demonstrate how Baba Sahib Ambedkar thought that caste is the instrumentality by which women are not merely surveilled, but their freedom is denied to them. But at the same time, Baba Sahib Ambedkar has an overdetermined kind of a notion of deprivation. And if I use this heavily used term overdetermined, Baba Sahib Ambedkar would say that Dalit women definitely suffer from a range of deprivations which probably upper caste women do not suffer, but with the proviso that caste is very important for Ambedkar as a barrier for women's freedom. But at places, particularly when he talks to women's groups, particularly Dalit women's groups, the way Ambedkar actually begins to take on ideas of care and ideas of trust, he seemed to be inveighing a greater deal of responsibility on Dalit women relative to other women. It is quite interesting that he does that in several of his talks to Dalit women. Therefore, while upper caste women and Dalit women are subjected to certain ways of exploitation, which is universal, Baba Sahib Ambedkar definitely sees Dalit women as subjects of overdetermined exploitation. And therefore, the kind of agency that he ascribes to Dalit women is much more substantial and much more reflective than he would actually ascribe to upper caste women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Valerian. There's one more question. Could you throw light on Ambedkar, Rawls, and Amartya Sen's views on justice?
Okay, that's quite interesting because that takes me into an article that I published years ago, where I try to develop certain comparisons with Rawls and Professor Sen and Ambedkar. Let me actually put it like this. There is a very strong relationship between the notion of egalitarianism that Rawls proposes through his concept of justice and Ambedkar. And probably Sen does not necessarily come very close to that kind of egalitarian thrust, number one. Number two, for Baba Sahib Ambedkar is much more committed to a thicker conception of the human. He is much more strongly committed to the idea of sociality, as Gita was pointing out, or community, and thereby a much stronger bond. And that bond comes through in several other places where he may not be discussing everything. So, for example, when he talks about his idea of nationalism, for Rawls, strongly influenced by Kantianism and the deontological approach that he adopts, this kind of thick human and a thick kilos, I think, is not acceptable. Therefore, something like overlapping that Rawls actually begins to think in the context of diversity or pluralism is also something which is deeply qualified by Babasaheb Ambedkar. Since he is committed to a thicker telos and thicker human pursuits, which he often defines as self-perfection, that all human beings seek self-perfection, but they define their self-perfection by themselves. The concept of self-perfection, I feel, is something which Rawls is not prepared to accept immediately. Just a couple of words about where Professor Sen and Ambedkar would differ. I can probably talk longer on this, but I don't think there is time much there. But I know somebody told me the other day that Professor Sen is extensively working on Dr. Ambedkar now. And at some conference, he said, what I am but a comma when compared to the achievements of Babasaheb Ambedkar. But I think Professor Sen has no inkling of what it means to be an untouchable. Sen has a concept of social exclusion. Those of you who have read his famous lecture on social exclusion at the Asian Development Bank would know this long talk. But untouchability for Babasaheb Ambedkar is not something merely of social exclusion. Untouchability for Ambedkar is treating a human as non-human, treating a human as inhuman. I think Professor Sen is not able to get this and probably begin to think in terms of what it means to reinvent our own common human in our times. Let me stop it there, Geeta. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks very much for that wonderful way of putting it, Valerian, because I think from his very earliest writings, Ambedkar has this sense of untouchability which is not really made its way into any understanding of social exclusion. So whether he thinks of the untouchable as he does in the Southborough Committee report, where he says his interests are primary because his very self has been confiscated. That sense of the confiscation of the self, which then turns us as much to ontology as it turns us to political philosophy or towards ethics. It's also about the nature of being itself. And when you started out, you spoke of how the word justice sits with a range of other things, morality, moral indifference, with a bunch of very, very different words. And I think Ambedkar is also directing us to imaginatively engage with what it means to be an untouchable. And from within that imaginative engagement, which is both, as he says, requires rationality and a stirring of conscience, but also an understanding of power. So I think that way it's very interesting you point that out. There is someone who has put up a hand, Mangala Siddesh Pandey, please.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
Hello? Yes.
Please,
You see, would it be right to say that either Ambedkar or Gautam Buddha were antagonistic to Brahmanism? Couldn't one say that they had a hierarchy for human beings All were not alike according to their spiritual temper, their ethics, and their values. And I read somewhere that Dr. Ambedkar was very influenced by one sentence of the Buddha. He said, "It is not by birth that one becomes a Brahmin. It is not by birth that becomes a Shudra. It is by one's deeds that one reveals oneself as a Brahmin or a Shudra."
Can I come in here?
Of course, of course.
Yeah. Again, it's a very large question. That is Ambedkar's engagement with Hinduism. Today, I think that question becomes extremely important without compromising the kind of stand that eventually Babasaheb Ambedkar took. Sometimes when we read Babasaheb Ambedkar, we do not know the kind of antagonistic engagement which the context is forcing on Ambedkar is so strong that we forget some of the nuanced understanding of Hinduism that he actually works out in a number of places. A couple of things let me mention. The first one is, if you look at Annihilation of Caste, Babasaheb Ambedkar says that it is important for us to re-look at Hinduism from certain vantage points. He thinks that probably the Upanishads can be an anchor through which we can actually rethink the future of Hinduism. This is one important consideration. But I think across his writings, he makes a very strong distinction between Vedic Hinduism and Brahminical Hinduism. I think this distinction is quite important, and the kind of consequences that arise from that distinction. Ambedkar has a very strong critique of the Bhakti movement at some points. But as Geeta has pointed out in her book, in her recent work on Babasaheb Ambedkar and the question of socialism, his involvement with the Bhakti movement was fairly complex because he dedicates his book Untouchables to
Chokkamela.
Yeah, Chokkamela. And the last thing that I want to say that Brahmanism, he says, or Brahminical Hinduism, put a stop to the Vedic traditions where a person is not born a Brahmin, but becomes a Brahmin. Now, interestingly, Babasaheb Ambedkar was very close to Ranade and picks up several lines of arguments of Justice Ranade. And those of you who have read Ranade would know that Ranade builds up this very powerful argument that Varna in the Vedic age were not based on birth, but on their training or education or commitments. So it is not birth. So there is a possibility of retrieval of a very different kind of Hinduism from Babasaheb's writings, which has not been undertaken. But I feel that today we live in an age when probably some attention has to be paid in that regard. Although there is the other critique of Ambedkar, which I think we should not actually compromise.
Thank you. Thank you.
I don't see any further questions in the chat box. If there is time, perhaps for maybe one question, anyone wants to raise their hands and speak?
I think participants can unmute themselves and ask.
Yes.
Instead of putting it in the chat.
May I?
Yeah,
Yeah,
please.
May I
Please.
something?
Yes.
Actually, thank you very much for an excellent lecture, Professor Rodriguez.
Thank you.
Very simply put, I just want to say that you talked about the individual and the community. And we know that the community is an extremely problematic concept. However small a group we consider, we know that with time they develop, exclusion, even though it may not be untouchability, but exclusion of a kind which verges close on untouchability, although the group may have started on level playing field. For example, Adivasis. I have worked with Adivasis in Maharashtra, and I see that the most oppressed and exploited groups practice, incredible exclusion and a certain kind of, I can't call it untouchability, but really close to untouchability. How do we understand and explain this so that individual aspiration is constantly in struggle with communities, not community, is in struggle with what is the general good of all, in this case, let's say, the community. So this struggle seems to go on. And how do we deal with it? How do we deal with this? Because these are very fluid things. When the individual comes into conflict with the community, it's fluid. At one point, he or she is a part of community, and at another point, the self and individual aspirations totally ignore community's good of, all, or community's notion of what is right and wrong, good and bad.
Yeah, again, probably the question demands a much longer engagement. Normally, I don't want to drop in names, partly because I think it is important for us to rescue Baba as a thinker on his terms, because there is a lot of attempt to absorb him into frameworks and paradigms worked out elsewhere. But incidentally, it may not be bad to mention that Ambedkar was a close reader of Aristotle and particularly Rousseau and T.H. Green. And all these three figures, later on, of course, most of this particular thinking becomes so much central to Ambedkar's own makeup of his own self. But all these three thinkers come to him as part of his legacy, studying with John Dewey. And all these three very strongly begin to talk about the significance of community in the constitution of the self. That if there is no sociality, and that is the word Gita has used, I too use this, if there is no community which recognizes me and extends to me supports, not merely economic, but also human and cultural and probably religious, Ambedkar thinks that my personality is going to be completely stunted. Now, there are scholars who have argued if there is if deprivation of sociality or community stunts human personality, how we explain the kind of agency that Baba Sahib Ambedkar ascribes to Dalits, because for Baba Sahib Ambedkar, the family becomes a center of the constitution of the self, very inadequate, very limited, but still it becomes the center where Dalit agency comes to be created. And if you have, we all read these days a lot of Dalit biographies. I cannot claim that I have read all of them. But one thing that stands out across these biographies is the way the family stood behind the growth of the child and ensure that his person does not get destroyed in the process of his or her encounter with the practices of untouchability. Now, therefore, we live in society where community does not play the kind of role that is envisaged as a norm. And to that extent, we can actually say that our growth prospects as human beings has become stunted. We grow into persons who, to use somebody else's phrase, as one-dimensional and are not able to eventually develop to our fullest self. This is one side of the answer. Quickly, the other point. Social exclusion has been practiced across groups, particularly among primitive groups. And Ambedkar also draws attention to this. And one of those quotations that I have given, where social groups practice exclusion. And this has been the case all the time. But Ambedkar makes a distinction between social exclusion.
Can you please unmute, Mr. Dekwad? Please unmute. Yeah, thank you.
But Ambedkar makes a distinction between social exclusion that is practiced by several communities and the practices of untouchability. He doesn't endorse social exclusion because he thinks that eventually our highest and the best self can be recomposed only through a community which is available to us and we are available to that community. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerian. Are there any further questions? There's another question, Valerian. Why would Ambedkar demand separate settlements?
Yeah, I would say that one has to make a slight distinction between programs of action and theoretical principles. Ambedkar definitely argues for separate settlements of untouchable communities because he thinks that it is almost impossible that the practices of untouchability would go living within the existing communities. And if they are separated, they would be able to restart their life in a very different way. But this is a program of action, a desperate cry for something different because there were no changes taking place. And I, among so many other things that I have seen during my research is that significant ways of life, both in urban areas and rural areas or villages in India, have not changed. And Dalits, by and large, tend to live outside the village, and there may not be everyday violence as we notice in some villages, but there is the prospects of violence, everyday violence, always looming large for everyone. And when Ambedkar makes a case for a public policy of separate settlement, he probably is this heart-rending cry that things are not changing and unlikely to change. So why don't you let us to start our life afresh?
There are two more questions, Praveen and then Jadu. Praveen?
Thank you, Professor Rodriguez, for this brilliant lecture. Sir, in the Q&A, you mentioned that the family is supporting the Dalit in it, as the writers of Dalit autobiographies have very clearly mentioned. Sir, recently there are arguments from a couple of Dalits who are also into academics, who are arguing that there should be a scope for the vagabond in the Dalit. And this is in one of the latest edited books by Jagannathan, B.R. Ambedkar and Social Transformation, in which you also have a chapter. Harish has argued that vagabond Dalit should exist, and the Dalit community should let go of the individual, should let go of the Dalit individual who wants to be a vagabond. Sir, given all these conditions, do you think the vagabond is contemplating for the vagabond is contemplating for the emancipatory goals, or let's say in the Ambedkarite principle of educate, agitate, organize? So thank you, sir.
Yeah, I have not seen some of these two of these papers that you mentioned, but the institution of the Parivrajaka, that is what I feel you are translating as vagabond. The institution of the Parivrajaka is something quite central to the traditions of Dalit communities. And those of you who are familiar with Khair Mode's work would know that within Ambedkar's larger family, that this particular tradition was pretty strong. Ambedkar himself, except for the Buddha, does not greatly celebrate the Parivrajaka institution, but for him, someone like Kabir, who we admired and considered him as a guru, was somebody who was actually rejecting ways of life. But Ambedkar eventually comes around to argue that while the Parivrajaka institution can be creative, it is not going to bring about social transformation. It can be creative because a lot of creativity can come up through the renouncer institution. But the renouncer has to come back, and begin to actually transform society. And he sees the Buddha doing that. So Buddha is not somebody who becomes the renouncer only, but comes back to transform society. See, this is a big shift that Babasaheb Ambedkar makes. Just a small point about the autobiographies that I made regarding. I'm yet to come across one autobiography that does not celebrate the love of the family that a Dalit child received, and that made him or her the kind of self she or he was. Just to give you one instance, Tulsi Ram's celebrated autobiography, the first part, Murdaiya. Think about the grandmother, the mother, and the father, the way they actually back him up. and make him what he is against the entire setting of the village, which actually pounces him and sees that he doesn't become the Tulsi Ram that he eventually became. Thank you, Prabhu.
Thanks, Valerian. I mean, apropos a comment in the chat box that the image of the so-called vagabond obviously would be a male image, a Dalit male image. I think it would be interesting to think of the Dalit family as you have described it from the autobiographies, as also constituting a model of the family that is not familiar to most of us, who perhaps represent the family in very limited ways in our understanding. A family as a patriarchal lineage, a family as a space that is very oppressive, which I think has been a staple of feminist writing, which is not untrue. But I think there is also a case to be made for different ways of being familial, and perhaps these autobiographies yield that notion of difference, which we might want to think about. There's one more question, Jadu.
Yes. Thank you, Professor Rodriguez and Professor Geeta, for sharing this very, very interesting, enriching, and very enlightening lecture. Whenever I listen to Professor Rodriguez, it is always pleasure and giving us so much input to think about. So whatever you have spoken, deliver on the idea of justice, it is very, very keen when we read Dr. Ambedkar. So I am thinking in the line of annihilation. Why not annihilation is a conception of justice? You said somewhere, and I read the abstract as well, morality and justice are very, very close. I mean, the other word of justice would be morality in a very deeper sense. So in this context, if I interpret annihilation of caste in certain ways, I would see that annihilation would possible to bring justice. So when annihilation would possible to bring justice, it is very, very serious charge against the caste Hindu. So in a way, it also direct towards the idea of the moral. So, but when we talk about the idea of annihilation as a concept, and Ambedkar would not compromise a comma from the book. So, but then one would read that Ambedkar is also an essentialist. I may agree to this point. I may call Ambedkar is annihilist or annihilationist that he mentioned in Buddha and his Dhamma. So when you are conceptualizing Ambedkar's conception of justice, do you think that the idea of annihilation also embedded in it? By when I'm saying it, I'm ready to take to call Ambedkar as annihilist or essentialist, because he would not compromise anything from his book Annihilation of Caste, and where he could imagine or foster the idea of justice. This is the question. Thank you.
Thank you, Jadumani. Again, very weighty question. I don't know exactly in what sense you are using the term annihilationist. I personally don't see Ambedkar as an essentialist. Because look at Ambedkar's theory of history. I'm before Geeta because Geeta has much greater understanding on this. Ambedkar would argue that when we actually look at the past, and you often quote Dewey in those contexts, there are millions of elements, and we actually begin from our present. We start from our present, our journey into the past. But then Ambedkar would not actually be a relativist. He would actually begin to argue that while my journey into the past might be unique and distinct, I need to actually negotiate my journey with others, and in the process, those issues that I have ignored would be brought home to me. I therefore think that Ambedkar thought that a democratic community or a community is the epistemic site around which we constitute what we regard as our truths. And therefore, the role of community, or in a wider sense, democracy, is not merely a site of public life for Ambedkar, but it is also the site where we actually begin to explore verifiable truths. Now, this is not definitely the kind of response probably your question demands, but I don't see him as an essentialist. And there are large arguments where he actually begin to attack fixities, he says, rigidities, because, and he thinks any kind of essential understanding could lead to authoritarianism, because you think that you know what is truth and begin to impose that truth on others. So I would actually bring him much closer to something like where we discover the truth from our side today, including the kind of history that we need to cherish. Thank you, Yadumani.
Thank you, Valerian. I don't know if we have any more time, and perhaps the host can tell us.
Actually, we are come close to the program. We are,
Okay.
yeah. So
No,
now it is time for vote of thanks.
Right. So thank you very much, Professor Rodriguez. It's been a delightful and reflective evening for many of us. And thanks to the Asiatic Society for hosting this amazing event. And I think it does great justice to Mira Kosambi's work and memory in some very important ways. And especially her identifying moments in the lives of women like Ramabai and Prema Kantak, which have not really been central to our understanding of equality, communication, and community. Ramabai was invested in forging a new community. Prema Kantak deserted her family and became part of Mahatma Gandhi's ashram in the hopes of building another sort of life and community. And both women were very invested in self-making, equality, and all of that you have referred to. So I think setting up conversations between unlikely figures through presentations like this also makes us revisit some things that we take for granted. So thank you very much for a great evening, and over to the Asiatic Society.
After such a fruitful discussion, it is now time for a vote of thanks. On behalf of the Asiatic Society of Mumbai, I thank Professor Valerian Rodriguez for a very thought-provoking talk, which made us understand the facets of justice and how equality is an essential and a fundamental precondition for social justice. I thank Dr. Geeta for presiding the talk in a skillful manner, and she brilliantly contextualized Professor Valerian's talk. Her inputs were truly valuable to us. I thank the audience for taking part in the talk and for having kept it very lively. Thank you all, and good night.
Thank you.
Yes, it's been truly amazing. It's been absolutely amazing, Professor Rodriguez and Geeta, and we are just extremely grateful to you. We've had a wonderful session, wonderfully rich and thought-provoking session. Thank you, and goodbye. Hope to see you again, maybe at the Asiatic Hall.
And Geeta, thank you for those wonderful comments. Yeah, just super. Thank you.
Thank you, Valerian. Hope to see you soon sometime.
Yeah, sure.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, same here. Yeah.
Yes, bye. See you,
Bye.
everyone. Thanks.
Bye. Bye.